Brilliant. So that's the recording there starting. I'm just going to share my screen. So can I just ask, Lisa, can you unmute and just let me know that you can see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes, I can see it, Nick.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, very good. So this fairly uninspiring photo that you can see in this opening slide, the importance and the relevance of it will become more apparent later on in the talk. This is a photograph of Hookfield Gardens in Borough. So just to get started, so that everybody's on the same page, I will be using a few archaeological terms, mostly periods that we're looking at. This talk will focus on the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. And within these periods, we break them down into the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic within the Stone Age, and the early, middle, and late Bronze Ages. These periods were developed by a man by the name of Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, who was the curator of archaeology in the Royal Museum in Copenhagen at the beginning of the 19th century. He was dealing with Danish antiquities, and he realized that while in much of the Mediterranean they had historical sources that would allow them to create chronology and work out which events followed which, in Northern Europe, we didn't have historical sources. And so you had to look at the material that the objects were made out of and use those as the basis of your dating system. So that's what we do, of course, in Ireland as well. Within the Stone Age, there are three periods: Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. The names come from Greek. Paleolithic means the Old Stone Age, Mesolithic is the Middle Stone Age, and Neolithic is the New Stone Age. The dates that are provided on this slide are as these periods occur in Ireland. There is no date against the Paleolithic period because we don't have any Paleolithic occupation within Ireland. The first people that we have arriving on the island of Ireland arrived already with Mesolithic technology. So the first settlers that we have on the island are Mesolithic, and they arrive around about 7,800 BC. This map here is just to show that really Ireland is very much a latecomer in terms of human settlement around the world. All of the areas colored in browny red here were settled by humans before Ireland was, with the exception of New Zealand, which shouldn't be colored in down here. New Zealand wasn't settled for several thousand years after Ireland, but all these other areas were settled first. The reason that Ireland was not settled is that in the Paleolithic period, Ireland was covered with ice sheets, with glaciers. And it wasn't until around 10,000 BC that those ice sheets started to recede. And at that time, sea levels started to rise, and Ireland then became separated from Britain and continental Europe. So it was isolated for some time. So it wasn't then until around about 7,800 BC that the first humans crossed to Ireland. Probably from the region that's now Scotland, although that's not entirely clear. This map then is showing the northern part of Northern Ireland, and in particular the Causeway Coast and Glens area, which is around about here. So here you can see the Kintyre Peninsula in Scotland. It's only separated from the coast of County Antrim by about 12 miles of sea. And of course, as anybody who's visited the coast will know, the coast of Scotland is visible. All of the locations that are marked on this map indicate sites that are known to have Mesolithic occupation. So people from the earliest period of humans arriving in Ireland there's evidence for them in all these locations. What you might notice is that they're almost all on the coast or in the river valley of the River Bann. Okay? This is because in this period, in the Mesolithic period, Ireland was heavily forested or wooded. And so movement would have been much easier along the coast and down in the river valleys. The earliest settlement that we have, I'll go back to that, the earliest settlement that we have anywhere on the island of Ireland is at a place called Mountsandel. Mountsandel is just to the south of Coleraine, on the eastern side of the Bann. So I've got photos of Mountsandel coming up, but that's where we get the earliest settlement anywhere on the island of Ireland. The people who settled in Mountsandel, by the time they established their settlement there, they already had distinct stone tools from what was found in Scotland. So we can presume that they had already been on the island of Ireland for a couple of generations before the settlement of Mountsandel was established. We're not sure where they would have lived before that, but it's possible that the land that lies between modern Portrush and out to the Skerries was once above sea level, and there may be earlier settlements in that area that have since been lost. One of the reasons that we think that people arrived on the north coast, and particularly settled and were very active along the north coast, is the abundance of natural flint. So flint is a very good stone for working tools, and it's found naturally within chalky deposits. And again, anyone who's been along the north coast of Ireland will know that we do have this lovely chalky layer. And if you go to places like White Rocks, just to the east of Portrush, you'll be able to walk along the cliff faces there and see the seams of flint and the nodules of flint sticking out, and of course all over the beach as well. So it may even be that people in Scotland had been able to see the White Cliffs and known that it was a good source of flint, or they may have just been curious and crossed over. But certainly the north coast attracted people, and it was almost certainly because of the abundance of the raw materials. Here we have some examples of the sorts of tools that were being produced in the Mesolithic period. The principal large tool was called the core axe, and we've got examples of them here. So that is a flint axe head, and then it would have been embedded inside a wooden haft. Sometimes it would have been glued in, or perhaps bound with animal sinew. So these axes were the height of technology at the time in the Mesolithic, and they would have been used for chopping down pieces of wood to be used in housing and to make other tools with. The main other tool type that we get in the Mesolithic period made out of flint is what's known as a microlith. And here we have examples of microliths. They tend to be between about 1 centimeter and 3 centimeters in length, and much, much skinnier, as you can see. They wouldn't have been used as tools in and of themselves, but they would have been attached to wooden handles and used as composite tools. So the two examples that we have here are an arrowhead, just here, and you can see that the arrowhead has these 6 microliths embedded into it. And here at the top, we have a serrated knife. So we have a wooden handle, and then we have microliths embedded into the side here. Residue analysis on some microliths would suggest that the glue that was used was a mixture of wood sap, ash, and beeswax. And that would have been mixed up together and just help those small pieces of flint adhere to the wooden tools. Obviously, the serrated knife would have been good, perhaps used as a saw, but more likely for cutting through rushes and reeds and that sort of thing. Here, our arrow, the microliths are providing nice barbs. Yeah. So if that went into something, it would have then been quite hard to pull it out. I should mention that this chap down here is supposed to be shown working flint. So he has a nodule of flint in his left hand, and he's striking it with a pebble with his right hand. And that's how they would have chipped off all little bits of flint to create tools like their core axes and their microliths. So here we are at Mountsandel. For those of you familiar with Coleraine, of course, here's Coleraine Town. Here's the Riverside Retail Park with Sainsbury's and B&Q. We've got Lidl up the top here, McDonald's, and there, of course, is the road bridge over the Bann. Coming down, we then have Mountsandel Wood. So here is the River Bann. Just out of shot, below the bottom of the screen here, we have the area known as the Cuts, and that's a natural stone formation that comes across the river and creates a weir or a small waterfall. And here we have the woods. Here we have Mountsandel itself. Mountsandel is probably the remains of an Anglo-Norman motte, which was built on top of earlier features. But the site of Mountsandel, the Mesolithic site of Mountsandel, isn't actually on the motte itself, but it's down in this piece of land here within the Mountsandel housing estate. So the settlement itself that we know about was located just here in the corner of this field. Here's a photograph taken in the 70s of that excavation. The site was excavated by Professor Peter Woodman, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. Peter excavated from 1973 to 1977 at Mountsandel, and it very much made his career as the Irish expert in the Mesolithic. In this photograph, you'll be able to see that there's the layer of topsoil here with grass on it has been scraped away, leaving a natural orange soil underneath. Within that natural soil then, archaeologists are able to see where there are changes in color of the soil, which indicate where there used to be organic material. So you can see arching around here, there is a lovely ring of post holes. And then in the center, there are other post holes. And then there's actually a hearth or a fireplace that's being excavated by the students here in the middle. So by looking at these patterns of post holes, and I should say, sorry, a post hole is where a wooden post used to be. The wooden post has rotted, and as it rotted, it has discolored the soil around it. So archaeologists are able to see this discoloration in the soil and excavate it, knowing that that's where a post hole was. So these post holes are actually the remains of 4 circular huts that have been built one on top of each other. So it wasn't 4 huts all contemporaneously built at the same time, but 4 successive huts. And that's all that we have at Mountsandel, but it's still incredibly important because we don't have settlement, or we don't have a lot of settlement information from this Mesolithic period. These huts were around about 6 meters in diameter. They had a hearth in the center, and the suggestion from the size and the angle of the post holes running around is that it may have been an igloo or sort of almost a wigwam type structure that was built over the top of it, using wooden posts and then using animal hides or maybe even turf to build up the walls. Because of the size of the structure, we believe that the roof would have been quite low, and therefore that you couldn't have had a chimney in the top. So we know that the only fresh air getting in would have been through a doorway. And if you have a hearth on the inside or a fireplace on the inside, it would have been incredibly smoky inside these huts. This might sound at first like not a very good thing, but when you think about the fact that that smoke would help fumigate the huts, and it would also help dry and cure any animal meat that was hanging inside, it could have been used for more than just cooking. As well as post holes and hearths, we also have much larger pits. And it was in these pits that we found remains of the rubbish created by people at Mountsandel. And it's through their rubbish that we're able to create a much better picture of how they lived their lives. The most common things that we get in these pits are the bones of salmon, We get lots and lots of hazelnuts, and we get boar bones, so bones from wild boar or wild pigs. By looking at the cycle of when these different resources are available then in the Mountsandel area, we're able to establish when people were living at the settlement, because these settlements were not occupied all year round. In the Mesolithic period, people were hunters and gatherers. They moved across the landscape and they used the resources that they found wherever they set up camp. It looks like Mountsandel may have been a regional settlement, a seasonal settlement that was used perhaps for 6 to 8 months of the year, and then people moved away at other times. So we know the salmon run at the end of spring and into the early part of summer. We know that pigs are born in the spring, but most of the pig bones that we get are of piglets around about 6 months of age. So these pigs are being killed perhaps in this part of the year, in the autumn. Hazelnuts ripen in late summer and into the autumn. And so if we find lots of hazelnuts at Mountsandel, we know that people must have been living there at the time when the hazelnuts are ripening. So really, it looks like they may have arrived each year around about May and then left perhaps in November or December. They stored some of their hazelnuts in pits so that they could come back and use them again, presumably in following years. But otherwise, they would have left and gone away. There's no evidence that they overwintered at the site of Mountsandel. At the site itself, there's very little to show its significance. As I say, this is the earliest known settlement anywhere on the island of Ireland. There is one plaque in the wood, close to the site, but not on the site. And that's because the site is actually in private ownership. It's not publicly owned. In partnership with Coleraine Rotary, Museum Service has been running a series of workshops over the last few years, only halted really because of the COVID pandemic, where we were taking children in P5, P6, P7, and then teenagers from around about year 10, and taking them out onto site and talking about archaeology and how people lived in the Mesolithic period. One of the questions that we were never able to answer until quite recently is what these Mesolithic people looked like. We know that it would have been quite a small population, and more or less the people who were living in Ireland would have been the same as the people living across much of Western Europe at the time. We call this group Western hunter-gatherers. It was a couple of years ago, some of you might remember it was all across the news, Cheddar Man, a Mesolithic body found in Cheddar Gorge, had his DNA studied and his face reconstructed. From the DNA study, we were able to see that his skin would have been quite swarthy, going into light brown. His eyes would have been blue, and that his hair would have been dark with possibly a curl or a wave in it. So here we get one of the reconstructions that was made of what Cheddar Man may have looked like. So as I was saying earlier, Cheddar Man was part of this Western hunter-gatherer group or population group, part of whom moved across to Ireland. So our first settlers in Ireland probably would have had quite a dark complexion, blue eyes and dark hair. As an archaeologist, I can say there has been a lot of things that we have hypothesized about over the years, but the more recent studies of DNA that geneticists have been doing have really opened a lot of new doors. One of the articles that I'll be referring to later on, written by Cassidy, is the Neolithic and Bronze Age migration to Ireland and the establishment of an insular Atlantic genome. The reference is there if you want to have a look. The article should be publicly accessible for free, but it really helps us build up a picture of who the people were who were living in Ireland at the time. At this point, I'm going to switch back to the main screen and see if there are any questions. So are there any questions about the material that I've covered so far?
Nick, have they done any radiocarbon dating or any other kind of dating of any of the artifacts that would confirm the ages?
For Mountsandel, certainly, there have been quite a few dates that have been gotten out of not so much the artifacts themselves, but these waste dumps. So the large pits that were used as dumps for rubbish. And those are the dates that we're getting that are bringing back, the earliest firm date is 7,800. So that is how we date the start of our Mesolithic period.
Okay, thank you.
And the man we saw in your picture, I think is like look like imagine those who are still living in Amazon area or in Australia or New Zealand part, the like 7,000 BC time. Probably this kind of people all here, I think. But how they came here and how. But how the Mexican people are here white, but why they went there now? So they are finished from here. Why they finished? Why they is they migrated from here to other part or something like that?
It is probably, Zahid, a case that we have populations. As an archaeologist, what we believe is we have populations coming out of Africa and spreading from Africa up through the Middle East into Europe, and at the same time moving from Africa across into India, Southeast Asia, down into Australia. So I would suggest that there is no direct relationship between our Western hunters and our populations, our indigenous populations down in Australia, but ultimately coming from the same population group. As you'll see as I go on a little bit further, the pale complexion is quite a late thing to come to Ireland. So what we would consider to be a typically Irish complexion, I know I have it, yes. I'm very pink, and then I burn, and then I go back to being quite pink again. This complexion doesn't come early to Ireland. This is a later thing.
Thank you very much.
So there's a question here from Harry. Harry is saying that he was brought up in Mountsandel, where they used to find flints in the plowed fields. Was that Hamill's farm, Harry, around there? I've spoken to a few other people who used to walk around in Hamill's farm and pick them up, especially after rain. They were easy to find. So we've, as a museum service, we've dealt with quite a few people who still live in the Mountsandel area, and in their gardens, they're pulling out flints all the time. Brilliant. So Harry's just confirming that the Hamills live next door to them. So even though Mountsandel itself is a particularly important and rare site, these flints that were being produced in the Mesolithic, that they do continue to crop up. So a question from Yvonne, would the migrations have arrived by boat? Almost certainly. In the period that we have people crossing to Ireland, Ireland was already an island. So they would have come by boat. We don't have any evidence of what their boats would have been, but something like a log canoe, or maybe even something like a curragh, a later Irish boat, where you have animal hides strung around a wooden frame, something like that probably would have been what was used. We do have evidence of log boats from slightly later, from the Neolithic period and onwards, but nothing quite that early. So will I crack on into our next period? So can I just get Lisa to confirm that you can see my slide again?
Yes, can indeed, Nick.
Yep, perfect. So that was the Neolithic period. The Mesolithic period. That came to a halt around about 3,800 BC, when we have what was probably the biggest change in the way that people lived their lives on the island of Ireland that we have ever seen. The change from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to the Neolithic settled farmers was probably more fundamental than anything we've seen since. So in the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, we have agriculture being established in Ireland. For the first time, we have evidence of domesticated goats, sheep, pigs. We have domesticated cattle. We appear to have red deer introduced into Ireland intentionally by people in the Neolithic period. We have giant deer before human arrival, but in by the Mesolithic period, the giant deer have died out, and there appears to be no native species of deer. In the New Stone Age, or the Neolithic period, we have deer introduced from Britain. And Neolithic people were doing the same thing out to the Scottish Islands as well. They were intentionally introducing deer to the landscape. And that's because it's something to hunt, ultimately. It's another food source. As well as domesticated animals, we have cereal crops being grown for the first time in Ireland. So probably we have barley and oats and rye established as the principal crops, with wheat coming in slightly later. We also have a change in architecture. Rather than our round sort of igloo-like structure, we now have square structures. So it seems to be a completely fundamental change in the way that people were living their lives. For the first time in Ireland, in the Neolithic period, we also get pottery being produced. If you think about it, if you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer moving around the landscape, you don't want to have something as fragile and breakable as pottery. But once you've settled down, you can start to accumulate stuff. We all know how that works when you settle down and you're established for somewhere for any length of time, you accumulate stuff. And for the Neolithic farmers, some of that stuff was pottery. So that gives us a great tool for dating sites if we can find pieces of pottery. The fundamental thing about Neolithic pottery is that it tends to have baggy bottoms. It doesn't have a lovely flat bottom, but rather curved or rounded bottoms. This might have been good in terms of strength for early pottery. It could have been good for spreading heat if the pot is being used for cooking. So if you think about a wok, that curved shape to it, I'm moving my hands around here, but I'm aware now that you obviously can't see them. We have that lovely curve to a wok, which helps to spread the heat around. The same thing might have been happening with Neolithic pottery. The other thing to remember is we're not dealing with a world that has lovely flat surfaces and lovely flat floors. The floors inside their square houses would have still been earthen floors. So if you want to balance your baggy bottomed pot anywhere, all you need to do is scrape out a little piece of soil away, and you have a lovely little curved area to rest your pot in. The DNA study that I was referring to earlier, Cassidy's study from 2016, it is really informative in telling us who these Neolithic farmers were. For a long time, it was unclear whether it was the indigenous Mesolithic population of Ireland just getting the new technology and developing it to become Neolithic farmers, or whether it was a new population group coming in altogether. The DNA evidence makes it fairly clear that we have a large increase in the population in the Neolithic period, and that they're coming from quite far away. Ultimately, from the area that we'd term Anatolia, or modern country of Turkey, coming really from the Fertile Crescent. So coming from southern Turkey, northern Iraq and Syria, spreading across up into Greece, and the Black Sea area, following up the Danube, following up the Rhine, and then across into Britain and Ireland. And they're taking their genetics with them. And it appears that they are then intermixing with the established Western hunter-gatherer populations who are already there. This skull belongs to a woman who was excavated at a place called Ballinahattie. Now, Ballinahattie is otherwise known as the Giant's Ring and sits sort of between Lisburn and Belfast. So this woman, the Ballinahattie woman, her DNA was tested as part of this 2016 study, and it turned out that 42% of her DNA came from the pre-existing Western hunter-gatherer population, and 58% came from the Anatolian Neolithic farming populations that had left Turkey and the Fertile Crescent, and over the course of several generations had traveled across through Western Europe. Here we have a nice facial reconstruction of what she may have looked like while she was alive. As well as their pottery, people continued to make flint tools. Their flint tools became more sophisticated, but it was still using the traditional grey flint, or the locally sourced grey flint from County Antrim, Ardenau area. The other big, I suppose, advancement in tool use was the creation of these porcelainite polished stone axe heads. So here are two examples from a site that I'll talk about a little bit later on called Corrstown. Here's the blade front, and here is a blade front, and then it comes back to this shape. This top one has been quite badly damaged. You can see lots of flints have been lots of pieces have been taken off, but these axe heads would have been polished so that they were quite shiny. You might be able to make out here, there's a patch of wear, where there would have been a wooden haft around this axe head, and this wear is from the axe being used and the wooden haft scraping backwards and forwards across the stone. There's another patch just here on this smaller axe head. These axe heads are quite important because there's only two places in all of Ireland where porcelainite was quarried. Those are in Teeth Bullia outside Cushendall and at the side of Brockley on the island of Rathlin. So here's Teeth Bullia here. And of course, Rathlin is the island off the north coast, just up here. On this map, you can see the distribution of porcelainite axe heads across Britain and Ireland. So there's a heavy concentration up here in North Antrim, but they're spread all the way down to the very south of Ireland, all the way around the Hebrides, up to the north of Scotland, down to the south of England, and we even find them in continental Europe. So these are axe heads that are being quarried and produced in what are actually termed by archaeologists axe factories up here in the very northeast coast of Ireland. But because of the trade networks that existed in the Neolithic period, they're getting all over Britain and Ireland and even into continental Europe. So quite a significant thing to be able to lay claim to up here in the northeast. Now, one of the things that, of course, happened with the introduction of farming was people needed to clear woods, okay? And of course, these axe heads are much better at clearing woods than the earlier core axe heads from the Mesolithic period. So we have more sophisticated tools for chopping down trees. People are chopping down trees to make fields so that they can graze their animals and grow their crops. And then as they grow crops, they have a stable food source, and we have a bit of a baby boom. We have an increase in the population, which means then people need to spend more time chopping down more trees to make more fields. And then there's more stable food, so we get a population increase. And we find a huge increase in population, and large areas of Ireland seem to be dewooded, deforested, in the Neolithic period, as people are establishing these permanent settlements for the first time. We get in this period the first evidence of warfare. There are two hill forts in South Antrim, a place called Donegal and Lyle's Hill, where we have evidence of warfare between them, the neighboring hill forts. And we have evidence for wooden palisades that were burnt down and lots of stone arrowheads that were fired into Donegal Hill. So we have evidence of warfare as people are starting to compete over the resources that they're creating, over land, and over the crops that are being farmed as well. In the same period, we also get the establishment of communal burial grounds. So in this period, it seems to all be about community. We don't have differentiation or hierarchy between different people. There must have been chiefs or religious people, but in this period, really, as far as we can tell, house sizes tend to be fairly uniform around settlements, and people are being buried communally. So the most famous of these communal burials is Newgrange, or Brunaboyne, down in County Meath, which is a passage tomb. So I would presume that most of you would have come across imagery of Newgrange in the past. We had these communal graves up on the north coast as well, although they're not quite as grand as Newgrange is. I'm only going to look very briefly at two examples that we have. Ossian's grave is a court tomb up outside Cushendall. It's not a particularly impressive court tomb. All that remains is this ark here, which would have formed a court where ceremonies to be held within. And then the bulk of the tomb would have sat back here and has since been removed. I'm flagging it up really because next week we'll be looking at myths and legends. And so Ossian is going to feature in those as well. A much better preserved tomb is Dewey's Cairn down near Dunloy, just south of Balmoney. Here again, you can see the stone outline of where the court was, where burial rituals would have been held. And then between these stones going back is a passage where cremated remains were uncovered. So Dewey's Cairn is the best preserved court tomb, certainly in the Causeway Coast and Glens, and it could be argued certainly the best preserved court tomb in Northern Ireland. Here's another photograph of it. Here's an outside line of standing stones, and you can see down here in the reconstruction, we would have had a court in the front, and then a passage running down here that was then covered by a mound of stones. So what we can see, if you visit Dewey's Cairn today, are the stones of the court around here, and then the outlying stones running down the sides. And here we have a plan of Dewey's Cairn. Within the cairn was found typically baggy-bottomed Neolithic pottery. We have, I think, 3 or 4 porcelainite axe heads were found within the tomb itself. We have flint arrowheads that are in the typical Neolithic shape, which is sort of a leaf shape, and the remains of 5 or 6 adult bodies, at least. So because the bodies have been cremated, it's hard to tell exactly how many bodies are in here. But this is fairly typical of these monumental tombs. And so it seems that they're either family tombs or community tombs where significant people are being buried. Perhaps it's chieftains or leaders, perhaps it's religious figures. It's very hard to tell. But clearly they're places of some importance. And they're large and they're visible. And if you map where megalithic tombs tend to be found in Ireland, they tend to align with later borders of chiefdoms and kingdoms. And so it might be the case that the people living on the landscape in the Neolithic period are building these community tombs on the borders of their land where it's visible to rival neighboring tribes. So they can say, this is our land, this is where our ancestors are buried. And it's laying claim and ownership to the land. And this is very much a development that we get in the Neolithic period. So again, I will switch back, I'll stop sharing and come back and see if there are any questions that we might have relating to the Neolithic period. No, that is okay. I can crack on and we will have a look at our Bronze Age, which is where we go now. So, Lisa, can I get you to confirm again that you can see the slide that I'm sharing?
I can indeed.
Lovely, thank you. So, the Neolithic period seems to come crashing to an end around about 2500 BC, with the start of the early Bronze Age. And in the early Bronze Age, we get a whole lot of changes that happen. Just as with the Neolithic period, we moved from round houses to square houses. In the early Bronze Age, we moved from square houses back to round houses. So we get new forms of architecture coming in. We get new types of really elaborate pottery. If we go back to the pottery from Dewey's Cairn, you can see that generally there's some decoration on these, but generally they're not highly decorated. In the early Bronze Age, we get all sorts of striking geometric patterns being put onto the pottery. Also, we get pots with flat bottoms for the first time. We get new forms of arrows. Arrows seem to be very important in the early Bronze Age. They're moving from leaf-shaped to barbed. And we get what are called braces, which are flat pieces of rock that seem to have been strapped to people's left arms so that when they fire a bow, the bowstring doesn't actually cut into their skin. It hits the bracer instead. So we get what we call an assemblage. It's a group of different artifact types that are all found together in this early Bronze Age. So new pottery, arrowheads, braces, and of course new domestic architecture as well. On top of that, we get the arrival of metalworking for the first time. So in the early 20th century, when archaeologists looked at these assemblages of materials, they said, well, obviously this is one group of metalworking people who have arrived in Ireland and they're all the same. And then they looked across in Britain and they looked in much of Western Europe and they found evidence of the same assemblage. So they found the same ceramic forms, the same deep incised decorations on the pots. They found the braces and the barbed and tanged arrowheads. These people were named the Beaker people by the modern archaeologists, based on the elaborate beaker pottery that they were producing. And so the fashion at the beginning of the 20th century was to view these as one migrant population that had come across. And because they had metalworking, people started to refer to them as sort of tinkers, you know, maybe itinerant metalsmiths who moved from place to place. As the 20th century wore on and the colonial powers of the time, their empires fell apart, new forms of archaeology came about and new ways of thinking about how we study the past came about. And certainly when I was at university, we were taught that there was no such thing as the Beaker period. Just because these same artifact or object forms were shared across large areas doesn't mean it was the same people. The example, of course, is that in Japan, they drink Coca-Cola. In America, they drink Coca-Cola. In Europe, they drink Coca-Cola. In Africa, they drink Coca-Cola. In the Middle East, they drink Coca-Cola. All those same populations also have access to iPhones and Adidas and Nike shoes. That doesn't mean that we're all the same people. So the attitude was that these were object forms that were being shared among existing populations rather than one population sweeping through. And so that's very much has been the prevailing line of thought on the Beaker people for the last 50 years or so, 50 or 60 years. Until the DNA studies came out in 2016. Among the bodies that were studied as part of this is this chap here. He comes from Rathlin Island, from behind McQuaig's Bar on Rathlin Island, and the locals know him as Ugg. What we can say is that he was an early Bronze Age man, almost certainly a warrior, and that he was buried very close to two other men. And the three men from that same burial area behind McQuaig's Bar all had their DNA studied as part of this 2016 study. They all proved to have roughly 1/3 of their DNA from our Western hunter-gatherer ancestors, a bit over 1/3 of their DNA from the Anatolian Neolithic farmers that came across, bringing farming for the first time, but the rest of their DNA, about 1/3, came from a new population altogether, who were known as the Yamnaya people. And the Yamnaya people originated north of the Black Sea, in the area of Ukraine and southern Russia, north of the Caucasus here, and they seem to have spread from there across through Western Europe, ultimately ending up in Ireland. On the map here, all of these darker orange areas are where you find evidence of beaker pottery and this beaker assemblage. Everywhere that you look here, we also have evidence of Yamnaya DNA. So it very much looks like we have a new population group moving in and bringing their technology with them. So the earlier thoughts about a single beaker people is probably closer to the truth than many modern archaeologists have learned at university. Now, the interesting thing about this Yamnaya DNA, as it appears in Ireland, is that it carries a DNA marker in it known as R1b. So R1b is only carried on the Y chromosome, which means that it has to be passed down directly from father to son. None of the populations that were in Ireland before the Bronze Age carried R1b, the R1b marker on their DNA. It is only after the Bronze Age, with the arrival of the Yamnaya people, that we get R1b appearing. Now, the big surprise was when it turned out that 84% of modern males from the island of Ireland still carry the same marker. So it looks very much like the vast majority of people who currently live on the island of Ireland are direct descendants from the early Bronze Age migrants who originated north of the Black Sea. And it's these people who brought the fairer complexion with them. So Ugg here probably had blue eyes, although they may have been brown. He certainly had fair skin and fair hair. And the other two bodies that were buried very close to him were the same as well. All three were related on the male side. None of their mothers were related in any way, shape, or form. And it very much looks like what we have in the early Bronze Age is a whole new population moving in, but a population dominated by males, and probably warrior males, who are coming in, and they are replacing the existing male population of the areas that they come to. So what we see here in the Western hunter-gatherer and Anatolian Neolithic farmer part of the DNA is almost certainly principally coming from the female line, and the Yamnaya side is almost completely dominated by the male side. And certainly if there's any questions about that, I know it can be quite complicated, and I don't know if I've explained it particularly well, so I'm happy to answer questions about that as we go on. But it does look like a whole new population of males coming in and replacing the existing male population in Ireland. So in the Bronze Age, we go back to a circular architectural style. We have the manufacturing of metalworking for the first time. So here we have a gold pectoral. This one's actually from further down south, but it's a nice example of the sorts of things that are being produced in this period. To the right, we have amber beads that were found in Curen Moss near Limavady. These amber beads date to the Bronze Age, but the amber comes from the Baltic Sea. So we have evidence here of continued trade between Ireland and the wider Bronze Age world as well. We tend to think of ourselves up here on the North Coast as being right on the fringe of the world, but certainly in the prehistoric period, we were very much connected by sea. The sea and the rivers connected us to the rest of Britain and to mainland Europe. In this period, most of the domestic settlements that we have were small, quite dispersed settlements. So a very low density settlement pattern. We would often have banks and ditches surrounding singular or sometimes 2 or 3 houses. And it looks like really people are living in farming groups across the landscape. We don't have good evidence of large-scale settlements, with one exception. The early Bronze Age lasted for around about 1,000 years. And then by the time we reach 1500 BC, we get slight changes in metalworking, in the way that metalworking is done, but also in the way that these tools then look. We get changes in pottery form. So rather than being lovely, elaborate beakers, we get much plainer pottery. I've got some examples coming up. And in the Middle Bronze Age, there's almost no evidence of settlements. Asterisk. So that was the case up until about 18 years ago. This is a Google Maps satellite image of Port Rush. Here, obviously, Ramore Head coming down. We've got the harbour. This here is the road to Coleraine. And here we have Hopefield Gardens. And across here, Macromina. So at the start of the 21st century, we didn't have any houses down here. These were fields. And then for the developments to happen, for these housing estates to go in, archaeologists were called in to have a look at these fields. Macromina was first, and on the eastern side of the field here, they found quite a few roundhouses, but there was no evidence really to link the roundhouses together. They thought maybe it might have been a succession of these small little farmsteads built over a long period of time. And there was no money at that stage to do any radiocarbon dating. So they didn't get to date any of those houses. But just for the record, once we're talking about Corrstown, there is evidence that there were houses over here in Macromina as well. When Corrstown was excavated, I don't think the developers quite expected what they got. Archaeological consultancy services were brought in. Initial assessments were done at the end of 2001, and the main excavations happened between October 2002 and May 2003. So here we have again Hopefield Gardens in the south of Port Rush. This is what it looked like back then in 2003. So you can see all the topsoil has been stripped back. We have this lovely ready subsoil. And then you can see where the excavators have been in removing the soil with organic material in it. So here you can see a ring emerging of a circular house. Here's another example. We have a circular outer ditch coming around here, and then we have a series of internal post holes. And using the wonders of science and my excellent photoshopping skills, we can start to reconstruct our house. Amazing stuff. So if we imagine this slot trench here would have had a solid wall being built up. And it would have been something probably wattle and daub, so a wooden frame and then sort of mud packed into the gaps in between. So we have a low wall coming up here. We then have our central columns from all of these post holes running around in the circle. In the front here, where the photographer's standing, we have an entrance. So we have a doorway into our house. So a low wall, large central columns, and then we would have had a pitched roof coming up and down. What the archaeologists ended up discovering at Corrstown was 74 circular structures. So if you remember earlier, I was saying that in this period, we have a very dispersed settlement pattern. We normally only get one or maybe two buildings found together. At Corrstown, we have 74. We have a further 2 W-shaped structures. And then we also have some evidence for early medieval settlement as well. We have a medieval structure and then an entire medieval enclosure with a ditch and bank, a kiln, possibly a house, and a souterrain or a buried chamber. But with this aerial photography, perhaps you can see that there are a whole series of circles here. And each of those circles is a Middle Bronze Age roundhouse. Here we have a plan of the excavation site. These two structures within the red are our medieval structures. So here's our medieval enclosure, medieval house. So we can ignore them and focus very much on our circles shown here. So what else can we say about Corrstown? These areas here have been termed roads. There's one here and there's another one here. And they're cobbled surfaces. So here we have a cobbled pathway or a road winding between houses. Here's another example where we have a slightly earlier house that has then had a cobbled pathway put over the top of it. So you can see all these large stones forming this cobbled surface. Here we have a reconstruction of what Corrstown may have looked like at its height. A conservative guess suggests that there may have been 300 people. There could quite possibly have been up to 500 or 600 people living at Corrstown all at the same time. And that makes Corrstown the largest Middle Bronze Age settlement anywhere on the islands of Ireland or Britain. So at the time that Stonehenge is around, contemporary with our Bronze Age, we have a larger settlement up at Portrush than there is anywhere in Britain. And this is quite remarkable. We don't know why it was settled. In this reconstruction, you can see Ramore Head out here. And then we have sand dunes, and then we come down to our settlement. Here we have some of the Middle Bronze Age horseware, pottery. So if you think about that lovely bowl that I was showing you earlier in the Beaker period, now this is much plainer and not particularly aesthetically appealing at all. What we get are a lot of molds made out of dolerite. So that's a lovely soft stone. So these have been dug out, and then molten bronze would have been poured into it for casting tools or possibly chisels. The best of these molds is this one, and it was used for casting palstave heads. Now, palstave was a special type of Middle Bronze Age axe, and you can see the reconstruction of it here. So we have the axe head and then the bronze axe there, and then it's been bound onto a branch of a tree. This special type of Middle Bronze Age axe. So these were all found at Corrstown. What we also have is this wonderful gabbro mace head. So this mace head, there's no scale in this photo, I'm afraid, but it's around about half the size of an adult human's head. So it's really quite large. It's made out of a stone called gabbro, and the closest sources of gabbro would have been the Giant's Causeway, and further afield from that, you would have had to have gone down to Scrabo in County Down. We can't say for sure who owned this mace head. This hole here would have had a haft in it, but it's a huge piece of stone and incredibly heavy. And we know from comparative evidence that maces have traditionally been seen as a symbol of authority. So we have an example here from a pharaonic Egyptian depiction of their ruler carrying a mace. We have Bishop Odo here on the Bayeux tapestry, holding his mace of office. Of course, we have the Queen at her coronation, holding the mace, and the civic mace is still used in council ceremonies today, whenever the council meets. So a mace is traditionally seen as this symbol of office and power. And certainly whoever wielded the mace from Corrstown must have been incredibly strong and really a potent symbol of power. So because of the nature of the site at Corrstown, 17 carbon-14 samples were taken, and 15 of those samples came back with dates that overlapped 1510 to 1410. So that's the very beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. So our settlement probably existed within this period, 1550, maybe as late as 1250. The end date is a bit harder to tell. But the remarkable thing is that so many of these houses respect each other. They're not built on top of each other, but they're built next to each other. Even though these settlement dates are quite close, between 1510 and 1410, this bracket, there does seem to have been two phases of construction at Corrstown. To the north, where we have our cobbled roads coming down, we have clusters of houses in their 2s and 3s, and their doorways all face onto the roads. Okay? So it's quite a haphazard selection of houses that all face onto the roads and respect each other. However, to the south, we have these lines of houses, all of whose doorways face to the southeast. So it looks very much like we have an organic settlement in the north, and then a more structured settlement down here to the south. So perhaps this is Corrstown 1, and this is Corrstown Estate built onto the end. Or maybe we have the structured settlement first, which then grew organically around it. The dates don't give us enough information to be able to tell which one comes first, but clearly there are two different periods of settlement here. That said, we still have the largest settlement anywhere in Ireland or Britain, regardless of which one was built first. So I think I will leave it there. I will just leave you with another couple of reconstructions. These ones were commissioned by the Portrush Heritage Group more recently. And so again, you have Ramore Head up here coming down to dunes, and then you have reconstructions of our roundhouses here. And then if we look at our plan, if you imagine you're standing just here on the road, this is what you may have been looking at if you were walking down through the streets at Corrstown in the Middle Bronze Age. So as I say, I will leave it there. If anybody's interested, Corrstown, a Coastal Community, Excavations of a Bronze Age Village, is the publicly available publication of the excavations there. If you look on Amazon, it's about 30 quid, but if you go direct to the publisher, Oxbow Books, you can get it for under 8 quid. So certainly if you're interested, it's well worth adding to your library. So, coming back now, do we have any last questions to finish off the evening?
It's nice to hear from you. Actually, we are amazed to hear the history. It's amazing. Yeah? People actually are crossing the border, across the countries, and few people differently. They also voting from Ireland to the USA. So sometimes maybe people cannot stay in a same place for long. Huh?
People are always moving. Yes, we tend to think that here, we're one population that hasn't moved or hasn't changed, but no, we're always moving. People are always coming and going.
Yes, this is the human character. Actually, we have to believe in that way. Actually, if some people know that there is a danger, but however he will go there, and he wants to achieve what else there he wants to know. So it's the common heredity in human nature. Anyway, today,
Always looking. Yes.
yeah, yes,
Thank
yes.
you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Zahid. I think, Kate, is that a hand up?
Yes, it is. Nick, the pottery, I'm down to a very mundane thing maybe, but is there much difference in the clay, or can you, that the pottery was made from, or do you know where it came from?
That is a really good question. I'm not a ceramicist, so the short answer is no. I personally cannot tell. I would imagine most of the pottery would have been locally made.
Well, that's what I would have imagined, but I just wondered where the clay came from.
I would imagine so, but I can't say for certain. I've certainly worked on sites, not up here, down in County Tyrone, where we've found evidence of the clay pit that was then being dug out to be used in the pottery. So there it was local, but up here I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, because some of those other sites, the clay would have developed into the like of bleak potteries or Coal Island potteries, or, but we don't have
Indeed.
anything like that around here.
Not anymore.
No, well, I suppose the brickworks would be the.
To stick with Portrush, in the medieval period, there's actually an established pottery at Portrush. There's evidence of locally made pottery.
Oh.
So clearly it was happening, but for specific examples for the Bronze Age material, I couldn't tell you.
Maybe we'll have that'll be part of one of the future talks. Thank you very much.
I'd like to do that. No, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, can I ask you, Nick, when I've been to Rathlin on the tours and seeing broccoli and the axe factory there, we've been told that boats and people came from as far away as the Mediterranean to buy the porcelainite axe heads. Was that right? Would they have as far away as there?
Now, we can't possibly know, is the short answer. The longer answer is certainly porcelainite axe heads turn up in the Mediterranean. That doesn't necessarily say that a chap from Sardinia has come all the way to Rathlin, nor someone from Rathlin has gone all the way to Sicily. But certainly the trade networks were good enough that the porcelainite was reaching the Med. So it might have been somebody from Rathlin traded it to somebody in Scotland who traded it to someone in East Anglia who traded it to someone in the Netherlands, and it worked its way down. Because it's prehistory, we don't have individual stories of people unless we're able to tell from their bones. And sadly, no one has died on the journey with a sackload of porcelainite axe heads or anything. So it's too hard to tell, but certainly they were reaching the Mediterranean, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Nick, I think Joanne had a question.
Yes, certainly, yeah.
When do you think the religion came to the island?
Presumably, religion has been around as long as people have. That's the presumption. The first time that we get evidence for it is in the Neolithic period, where we get evidence for various rituals for around the burial of people. So,
like religious people may believe that human beings were made by God, and then by maybe people don't believe in religion, they believe in maybe evolution, like people all came from South Africa, and then they changed into the way we are now by millions of years, according to the environment, the weather they have been living in. So I don't know, as a professor, What is your opinion?
As an archaeologist, I very much have to follow the more evolutionary side of things. Certainly, people have been around for a long time. People have been in Ireland for over 10,000 years. In the Neolithic period, as I was saying, there's evidence for people having what looks like religious rituals. And by the beginning of the Bronze Age, we have stone circles being built in Ireland. So they are, again, presumably some form of religion. We don't have evidence of actual religious figures until much later. So we get written records from Greek and Roman travelers about Druids being in Ireland. But we don't get written records from Ireland itself until Christianity comes. And that doesn't come until around about 430 to 450 AD. So it's quite a long time after what we're talking about this evening. But this evening, again, because we don't have things written down, it's all based on what people have left behind, and that causes all sorts of debates as people interpret things different ways.
Yeah, thank you. Because I always have a little debate with my husband because he is religious and I am not. I'm educated like in a different place in China, so it's quite interesting. Thank you.
No, you're very welcome.
I just thought I'd show one of the flints that I was talking about. I dug it out. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, yes. That is a late Mesolithic butt-trimmed flake.
Okay.
I can identify that fairly easily. It's a fairly iconic shape. For a long time, they were called band flakes, but that's because they were initially found predominantly along the band, but now we find them in lots of other places. So we go about the more technical butt-trimmed flake. So that's late Mesolithic. You're probably looking about 5,000 BC to about 1,000 BC.
Right, thank you. That's interesting.
It's a lovely piece as well.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, folks, is that us for questions? Yep. Lovely. Thanks so much for coming tonight. And thank you very much, Nick. That was so interesting. I'm now going to stay on for half an hour and ask Nick all my questions. I'm joking, Nick. But we'll hopefully see you next week then. So Nick, it's Myths and Legends next week.
It's Myths and Legends next week, and you're stuck with me again. But then it'll get more interesting after that with different speakers. So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, we'll see you then, guys. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye,
Take
folks.
care. See you next week.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Okay, everyone. Bye-bye, Margaret. Bye, Andy and Naresh.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, bye.
Bye, Lisa. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Bye.
Super. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank
All
you,
the
Nick.
best, everybody.
Special thanks to Nick. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, I'm just going to stop.